Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I'd like to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we conclude a 3-day program on the therapeutic uses of psychedelics. Over the last week or so, I've been bringing to everyone's attention as we've been beginning our programs, the fire that has been threatening the Yosemite National Park, Mariposa Grove, where there's a stand of 500 sequoias, the mother trees, some of which have stood for over 3,000 years. The fire was human-made. It has been spreading over the last 48 hours into the Sierra National Forest. There's been more road closures, and we have been holding the mother trees there in Mariposa Grove. And just as a reminder, the Mariposa Grove was established by Abraham Lincoln in 1864, even during the tumult of the Civil War. Lincoln reached out to the West and saved a very precious grove of ancient redwoods. And they are now threatened. And there's over 1,000 firefighters that are doing everything they can to save that precious little grove of sequoias. It's worth mentioning that in Portugal and Spain and India and France, there's also fires because of the extraordinary heat that has been generated. And as you all know, once a fire starts, if it gets sufficiently hot and the wind conditions are just right, it creates its own weather system of intensifications of both the heat and the wind. And that's what's happened in Yosemite, and that's what's happening as we speak in Portugal, Spain, and France. So as we begin our session today, it's very important that we take in the fragility of our world and how human actions are now threatening what it is that the most ancient life forms have bequeathed to us as we engage in wanton disregard for the larger ecosystem out of which we came and back into which we will all return. So welcome to Humanity Rising today, everyone. Let us start, as we always do, by just taking a moment to just center ourselves in our bodies, in the realization that we are nature. I'm speaking to you as nature. You're listening to my voice and seeing my countenance as nature. We are nature, communing with nature. And let us close our eyes if we can and center our attention on our hearts. And for the next minute, to the tunes of the Ave Maria, the Great Mother, let us give thanks that we're alive. Let us be aware of our responsibilities. And let us, in this moment, send nurture to the sequoias and trees everywhere that are burning. Thank you, everyone. Before we dive in to the therapeutic use of psychedelics, I want to just alert you to an upcoming course that Ubiquity is offering on the shadow with someone who is deeply immersed herself as a psychotherapist into how people can integrate their shadow into a larger framework of responsibility and abundance. Connie Zweig, who's written a number of best-selling books on the shadow. And as you all know, Humanity Rising, since we begun 2.5 years ago, has really tried as best we can through our programming and in the courses that we're offering to provide people with opportunities for personal development, for personal growth, as the world spins increasingly out of control and our ecology becomes more and more turbulent and our geostrategic realities become more and more conflictual. People are under stress everywhere in the world in unprecedented ways. So how we deal with burnout, for example, and how we, as we'll comment today, how we deal with our own shadows is of urgent human concern. So Connie, I welcome you to Humanity Rising, and I asked Connie just to come in and just take 4 or 5 minutes to say a little bit more about our course. I'll put the link in the chat, but you can find it on ubiquityuniversity.org and our live courses coming up. It's going to be our first course offered for our September trimester. So Connie, tell us a little bit about the course.
Jim, I want to thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'm a little choked up. Often in these mornings, it's early morning here in California, when I listen to you, your eloquence brings me to tears. And that's what happened just now. So thank you for remembering the trees. Thank you for all that you're doing. George, thank you for all that you're doing with Humanity Rising. It's very meaningful. You know, we are seeing the shadow in the headlines screaming at us now every day, in our politicians, in our celebrities, in our media. We are seeing sort of the dark side of humanity erupt in all kinds of ways. And it seems to me that what each of us can do, one of the things that each of us can do besides our activism, is to begin to look at, attune to our own shadows, our own personal unconscious material, and the way that it might be erupting in our lives, and the way that it might be sabotaging our higher intentions, and also hurting people around us, even people we love. And so this 4-part course that starts on September 7th for Ubiquity is called Shadow Work, Finding the Gold in the Dark Side. Carl Jung, who coined the term shadow, said that its essence is pure gold. In the first class, we're going to look at how we meet the shadow in ourselves, the many ways in which we encounter our unconscious, our difficult, challenging emotions. Some people call them dark emotions. Our repeating habits that we can't seem to control, even addictions, our hurtful behaviors. And then in the second class, we're going to look at shadow boxing in relationships. How do we act that out with the people we love? And, you know, when I was in clinical practice, people used to tell me all the time, we're having the same fights over and over and over again. And so shadow boxing is a description of how and why that happens. And shadow work offers you a way to break these patterns and deepen your own authenticity and self-knowledge, and also the way you relate to your beloved. And then the third class is a little bit different. We're going to look at the unconscious as the unlived life, all of the material that is in the shadow that we haven't expressed throughout our lives. And for many people, it will be about creativity. For other people, it will be about lost talents and dreams, or unexpressed feelings that they really want to express now. And the fourth class will be based on my new book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Soul Role to Soul. And we're going to meet the shadows of age. It turns out that based on research at Yale University, our unconscious beliefs and attitudes about age through the lifespan actually shape our experience in midlife and beyond. So let me say that again. The beliefs and attitudes and images in our shadows about growing old shape our experience of it. And that research just kind of knocked my socks off. So the fourth class will be about that, based on the inner work of age. So I really hope people will join me there. It's a full range of shadow work, and I'm very excited to be able to offer it. And thank you for that, Jim.
Thank you, Connie. You know, it's a sobering thought, everyone, what Connie just said, that particularly the unresolved aspects of our shadow help shape who we are and how we perceive as we age.
Yes.
And which means that just because you're ignoring your shadow doesn't mean it's not affecting you.
That's right. It's deeply affecting us and coloring. It colors our projections. We can see that in politics. It shapes our longevity, it turns out, our memories, our brain health, our cardiac health. Because if we have dark expectations, negative modeling from our youth, that young is good and old is bad, and we're all growing old, that's something we all have in common, then those unconscious expectations will actually color what we experience.
Amazing. So that's the course coming up, everyone. I'll put the link in the chat box. Encourage all of you to make yourselves available for it. And then we will say more about it, maybe have Connie back before the September trimester, just to say a few more words about it. And those of you who are watching, just go to ubiquityuniversity.org, and you can go to our live courses and register for the course. So thank you, Connie.
And I'll go behind the curtain and watch this interesting show today.
Actually, Jim, I have a suggestion. Connie, why don't you stay with us and join it? It's a wonderful dialogue, and I know you can contribute interesting things to it. So stay with us if you like.
Is that okay with you, Jim?
Beautiful, wonderful.
Oh, okay,
absolutely.
thank
What
you,
a great
George.
idea, George. What a great idea.
Thank you, George. I'm going to get some water and I'll be back.
All right.
Good. Well, I want to bring on George Caponelli, who you all know is my good friend and colleague, who's put together a number of programs for Humanity Rising and had the idea to do a program on the therapeutic use of psychedelics. And so over the last 3 days, George has put together a splendid array of therapists and psychedelic aficionados. So George, with great pleasure, I turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Jim. And as usual, we'll invite you back in the not too distant future to join us. Thanks. So good morning, everyone. Terrific day. It's been a terrific week. We began on Wednesday with 3 extraordinary people from an organization called AWE, who are doing remarkable work in Central Africa, in the Amazon, and in Mexico, working with a variety of plant-based medicines and other therapies. And I want to stress the fact that today is not just about psychedelics. It's also about a number of healing modalities and therapies that are so critical to life in these times. And we are certainly in extraordinary times. Yesterday, we had a terrific opportunity to spend 75 minutes or so with Stan and Birgitta Graf, and it was a pleasure. I mean, he calls himself a psychonaut, having traveled in these territories for a very long time. And it was a pleasure, and Birgitta is such an extremely valuable soul herself, and her ability to continue to work with Stan is making such a great difference. So today we are going to get into this proposition in a variety of ways with some wonderful folks. I'm not going to give you all of their in-depth biographies, but you'll be able to view these when you look at the post section on Humanity Rising Solutions website. So as I introduce you, if you'll come on, please, Michael Osterlenk. Let me put us, there we are. Michael is a licensed psychotherapist, completed his MA in transpersonal counseling at John F. Kennedy University. He does a variety of things. He's certified in spiral dynamics and Wade mindsets, and he's the director of the Human Resilience Center. He's head of he's a head instructor and master coach at Sealift, and a variety of other things that he's going to tell us about. Michael, it's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you, George.
Peter Fairfield is a doctor of Oriental medicine and an acupuncturist. He's been practicing for, 145 years, Peter? Is that what?
Only 44.
Yeah, and he's done a lot of work with biofeedback at the UCLA Pain Unit and Mass Rehab Hospital in Boston, lived in China, India, Nepal, and does a variety of fascinating and valuable practices. Dr. Ann Shelton-Crute, can you come on? There you are, thank you. Doctor of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine, licensed acupuncturist in the San Francisco Bay Area. Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic, Tibetan herbalism, Chinese pole star astrology, and a variety of other skills she brings us today. And last but not least,
thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thank you. Deborah Paris-Snyder, who's the co-owner and publisher of Synergetic Press. I often say that in a different way, and Tango, as I know her, always corrects me. Synergetic Press has published over 40 books in ethnobotany, psychedelics, biospherics, social and ecological justice, and they're all terrific books, and she'll share a little bit more about that. She also had the privilege of being on the team that designed and built Biosphere 2. John Allen is a principal part of all of that, who's another giant in the world of thought and evolution and consciousness. And Connie Swag, who you just had a chance to spend a few moments with, will be joining us. It's glad to have you all. So, clearly the world's in trouble in so very, very many ways. And clearly we and the other species and the planet itself can use all the help we can get. So the therapies, both plant-based medicines and herbs and other therapies that you all pursue, and those that Connie, you write about, and Deborah, that you publish and have been involved with for a very long time. Let's talk about how each of you comes quickly. Remember, we have a dialogue and we want to keep all that going, but quickly tell us how you come to be doing the work that you're doing in the world. And let's begin with you.
Sure. Hi. So, gosh, getting into this work, I would really trace this back to, I had even as a very small child, I had a fascination with Asia that I really couldn't explain. I just couldn't get my parents to feed me enough Indian food. And it was great because when I finally went to go train in Ayurveda and lived in India, I was like, great, it's not Indian food, it's just food here. So I always had a very deep interest in philosophy from traditional East Asian the traditional East Asian philosophy in general, but medicine in particular. And it really came to a point of urgency. When I was living in New York City, I had just finished university, and someone drove an airplane right over my apartment building into a big office building. There were two of them downtown in New York City at the time. They're not there anymore. And I was close enough that I had front row seats to the whole event. And it was a very transformative experience. It was really a wake-up call. And I was actually right above St. Vincent's Hospital. And there was a line forming throughout the day of people who were hoping to donate blood to anyone who might need it. Unfortunately, the people who were involved didn't make it to the hospital and need medical services. But there were lots of other events that happened. Notably, the power went out, the phones went out. You know, we were in full-on crisis. And I remember thinking, we really have a problem, because I can see that hospital, which may be receiving hundreds or maybe thousands of patients any minute, they're on generators. And how long is the supply grid going to last? And how long is the supply chain going to last? I mean, some of the things that we're asking ourselves now due to climate change and the pandemic that we've been in, these are questions I really started to look at, you know, when I was in my early 20s. So at that point, I thought, okay, we do have access to traditional medical models. They are very esteemed, and we need to be sure that we protect that knowledge, that we research it deeply, and that we hold that knowledge. So that is how I started to get on the path of understanding Chinese medicine, Ayurveda. Started with something as simple as shiatsu, massage, and yogic practices, inner work like that. Bringing it outward. And now we have 2 clinics here in the San Francisco East Bay where we're offering Chinese medicine. And I'm also practicing Chinese pole star astrology, which I studied via apprenticeship with my teacher. And I find that to be a very deep way to help people come into context with our times. You know, it's all about understanding the context that we're in and navigating it in a way where we can feel empowered and find healing, and it needs to be catered to the individual. So that's how I found this work.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Michael. Shorter, just so that we have a chance to get into the topic itself, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So I would say my path started around age 9 that I'm aware of. I had some learning disabilities and health issues, and I saw a psychiatrist. And at the end of the session, I turned to my mom and I said, "He smokes, he's fat, he can't help himself. How can you help me?" Yes, I was a very obnoxious 9-year-old. And fortunately, instead of my mom making me go see the psychiatrist and get put on medication, she sent me to a psychotherapist named Pat Lawson. And Mrs. Lawson taught me biofeedback, guided imagery, meditation. This is 1979, so you can imagine the technology of biofeedback was very, very, very limited. But it was amazing. She opened many doors for me, got me into martial arts. I started reading on Eastern philosophies. So, Anne, I feel you on that interest. My first 3 books were Daisaku Suzuki's Zen Mind, No Mind, Zen and the Martial Arts, and a book on yoga. So that's kind of set me off on this path. And transpersonal psychology as a master's degree, postgraduate training in somatic psychology at the California Institute for Clinical Studies, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll share more of my bio as we go on, but I know we're short. So thank you, George.
You were muted, George.
Deborah, please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I started after college. I got a one-way ticket to the south of France because I was in love with France and the people and the food. And I knew that I had to get outside of my culture if I was ever going to learn anything. And I really didn't know what to put down, on those CVs everybody was filling out about experience. So I went out to get experience and travel. And I fell into some interesting into a group of people doing some outrageous things in 1981, 82. They'd built a ship. They were sailing around the world, started an intentional community here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. where I've actually ended up. So I fell into a really fantastic group of thinkers and doers that the Institute of Ecotechnics has emerged from. And in those years of experience, I moved and worked in different biomes. I spent time in Australia working in the Northwest Kimberley doing pastoral regeneration work. And I started publishing companies called Synergetic Press to bring out books in these exciting fields that I was learning about, ethnobotany, the biosphere. And it began a road of learning that I have not left. And here I am now in Santa Fe. I was an apprentice learning these things in the early years. And now I'm starting to develop biospheric study courses here to continue to try to get the knowledge across of both the indigenous wisdom about the plant medicines that's disappearing at a very rapid rate. Richard Evans Schultes was one of the people that I met, a speaker at one of the conferences, and I began a line of publishing with him. And really his legacy that kind of introduced me to the whole plant world through ethnobotany. And psychedelics became part of that because, of course, I published the Ayahuasca Reader. And so then I continue with really the idea of planetary stewardship and helping to capture and to transmit key knowledge bases, key knowledge bases of knowledge in both plant medicine and biospheric studies.
Thank you, Deborah. I have this on mute because as soon as I can take a break, I have some birds that are causing a ruckus in the background. But
I love the sound of those birds.
Yeah, I know you do. Peter, talk to us about how you got into this work, please.
When I was about 7 or 8, somebody told me about infinity, and I couldn't figure it out. My mom said it was something that didn't begin or end, so I tried to feel it, and then one day I got there. Later on, I realized that was a transmission of non-duality of emptiness. And so without realizing that's what it was this core of connection that connected me to nature and my own pain and problems at that time. I was guided to live in various communities, and I started to do healing as a little boy, not realizing that's what it was. And so I had this juxtaposition of my own issues and these things that were coming out of me. And so I've always been able to feel plants, talk to them in a way. Sounds like my meds were wearing off. But so plants have been important in the late 60s. I did a lot of exploration in various psychedelics that kind of broke me open. And then in the process of putting myself back together, I discovered various kinds of meditation and ended up studying healing, Chinese medicine, studied in China, Taiwan, a little bit in Tibet and India. And so my interest, I spent a number of years in Asia looking at the physiology of spiritual development. In other words, opening up the being to find this innate purity of essence. And so my practice with acupuncture and healing, meditation, Qigong and stuff is about releasing that and opening that and understanding that. When I did long retreats in both China and the Himalayas, and I discovered that I could get to states equivalent to any of my previous psychedelic experiences by doing long, intensive practices. And the buildup took a long time, and the recovery was very different because it was more integrated. And so my interest in plant medicines is how do I replicate that? And my interest in practices is how do I replicate that? I do want to say one thing. In my study of the physiology of humanity and spiritual development, of course, the heart is the gate, the opening. I don't believe you can get to the higher dimensions until the heart is open. My experience with the sequoias, whenever I saw a sequoia, and at first I didn't realize there was a difference between sequoias and redwoods. Sequoias would make my heart ache. When I would be in the presence of sequoia, I would feel this achiness in my heart. And I would feel this spirit. And of course, you all know that the heart is timeless. There is no space in the heart. We can connect our heart to any consciousness, any being. And so we can connect our hearts to the sequoias just by having that intent. And it's really how humanity connects. And we look at all the problems with humanity, it's really based on the denial of our own heart, our own feeling, our own conception with each other. And so I believe that opening up the heart, which has really been the basis of my own healing and the healing I do with others, is primary. And so whether it's sequoias or whether it's people in various countries under war and all that, by being present in our heart and sending a feel of our heart, our love, our opening, that's a powerful thing we can do. And psychedelics, plant medicines are, of course, part of that. We use plant medicines. My specialty is medical psychiatry. And so you can use plant medicines and acupuncture, all that, to shift personality, undo blocks, open up emotions, and bring out that innate essence. So that's kind of what I do and kind of what I'm working on.
Thank you very much, Peter. Connie, just a few more words yourself about how you got here.
Well, as I'm listening to everyone's story, I'm reminded of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, because each of your stories has these key moments. And it sounds like for many of you, it was about meeting a mentor or a teacher that opened your path. And the same is true for me. I began meditation at age 19 and everything changed. And so I've been focused now for more than 50 years on exploring consciousness. And in my 20s was plant medicine. But since then, it's really been about contemplative practices, primarily from the Vedanta tradition.
Thank you, Connie. So between you, we have enough experience, understanding, strategies, techniques to turn the world at least 8 or 12 or 15 degrees or something on its axis. The question I really have is, what can we do? I know each of you does various things in your own discipline and using your own skill set. A world in crisis. How do we recognize that time is running out? And what do we do to expand the reach of the skills and the knowledge that each one of you have, so that we can perhaps touch as many lives as possible before the string runs out? Just some thoughts. Michael, start with you.
Yeah, so, yes, time is running out, perhaps, but I would be careful in articulating it that way, because if we operate from a place of fear, we know how the brain works, and we might not make the best decisions for the long haul. So I go back to what Connie was saying in terms of our long-term contemplative practices. We got to make sure that, yes, we see the short-term, mid-term, and long-term problems that we face, but we need to do it with it, listening to what our friend Peter said, with an open heart and an open mind, and not operate from a fear-based place. And speaking of the plant medicines, I think the democratization of the medicine medicines are a really good thing. But I have 4 concerns with them, and I'm not going to share at this moment, but I would like to share at some point, because I'd love to get your all's feedback on it. Because the 4 concerns that I have are kind of nice ways of answering the question that you just asked, George. And I'll stop there.
Peter.
This world is so polarized, with just the information on COVID, the pillars of our democracy, our Congress, the courts, and the media, and all of that has been jeopardized and bastardized, and people don't know what to trust, and it becomes tribal, what we believe and what we think and how we act. And so the communication has been so difficult and so separated. So what I think is that we have to be very, very careful in our own judgment. As soon as we judge somebody else as wrong or different or uneducated, whatever words we want to use, we're off. And so to have a great understanding that people are coming from very different experiences and knowledge bases, love them and understand through that, and try to find a communication pattern that doesn't deny somebody, that in a way can open up a door to just share something else. And even if it's just a feeling or a positive or an acceptance, I find that it's a great help.
I just want to say something to both you, Peter, and to you, Michael. I believe that there's a difference between fear and reality, and that at the moment, in my experience, there are far too many people in our society that are living in denial of the challenges we face.
Yeah,
I agree with you both that in your case, Peter, the heart needs to be open, and the judgment doesn't serve us but further divides us. and you, Michael, that fear often closes us down, and we end up inheriting and manifesting the thing that we fear most. And I want to keep in mind that there are moments, I call them moments in extremis. And when you talked about your experience that day in New York as the plane flew overhead, there are moments of crisis and consideration. And the one thing I don't want us to do is to defer things into a future that need to be addressed now. That's just my perspective. Other thoughts on what we can do? Yes, Anne.
I would say I agree about this concept of fear versus reality. So, when we're talking about psychedelic therapies, we're talking about healing ultimately. And just to echo something that I think that Connie said about, when you have a pivotal moment with a teacher, and we have to remember that, or I think it's useful to remember that these plants are entities, and so it can be very simple. If we don't have access to a safe way to use psychedelic therapies, it can be much simpler than that. We can even just work with our desire force. We can trust our desires. Say, I like marjoram, the herb, I can sit with marjoram, the herb. I can reflect. Do I have an ancestral connection to the area where marjoram grows in the Mediterranean? I can look back at my ancestry. I can work with healing. I can work with ancestral traumas in this way. And I can be right there in the moment with that plant in my kitchen. And I can come into reality vis-a-vis, just something as simple as this relationship with a plant ally. So this fear versus reality concept, what can we do to feel safe to experience reality? That's what acupuncture offers us, a way to the points, the diagnosis from a skilled practitioner can choose points for us to help us feel safe to relax those traumas and drop into that heart space if we have difficulty finding it.
Deborah.
Yes, I have thought a lot about this problem, about what to do. Since about a year ago, when I went to Lake Powell for the first time, and the water levels were 50% of what they normally were, and the temperatures were 110 degrees. And I sat there on my first vacation in my lifetime, probably, sitting on the side of the rock, with fires and smoke coming from all around that were burning on either side, looking at this surreal image in front of me of the most beautiful, majestic kind of creation that I had cannot fathom how it got created there. You could see the wash tub line, they called it, and fish were floating because it was so hot. And I understand what the image of what a biosphere is and how everything is so related. And for the last 30 years, I've been, why is it taking so long for people to understand that we are nature? It's as simple as that. It seems impossible. And what you said, Anne, about making a safe space so that people can experience reality. Well, I think that may be what it is, because nobody wants to experience that reality because it is too scary to think about it. Denial is more than just a river in Egypt. It is, it is everywhere. And I think, and I appreciate also this bringing up, for my own work, the idea of, really evaluating where are my behavior patterns that are holding me back and things like that, because it is only can start with us, with the individual. And for so many years, we've had this pillaging of nature, not putting the value of nature on corporate balance sheets, the not recognizing that everything is connected just from such a, and so psychedelics in consciousness work, deep practices can open this realization up for people. And then once they have seen it, what do they do with it? So what I'm trying to figure out now is how can we take get across the idea. As people still do not know what a biosphere is. We failed. That effort, was shut down. People still don't know what a biosphere is. So I'm doing educational programs to try to get a visual image, to work on infographics, to try to get images of what a biosphere is, how we are all connected. And then maybe when we have integration work and things like that, we can start to give some actual ecological grounding in what people have had, that aha experience. Oh my God, what does that mean? How can they interpret that and put it into their daily lives? Because once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So I think that is some kind of a shift in that. When we talk about the shift in consciousness, how that's where I feel the work has to be. And I think hearing, listening, not judging, all of that, to what people that have, so we're not preaching to the choir, to reach people that need to see this understanding. That's where the work is, and that's where I'm looking.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. What I want to say is that Jim mentioned it earlier in the introduction when he was talking about Connie's course and program. One of the things that our goal is going forward with this expansion of Humanity Rising is to create the kinds of courses Connie's creating and Ubiquity has been delivering for a long time, and you've just been talking about, Deborah, so that viewers become part of a kind of new global commons in which, instead of just being passive viewers, we go into and develop greater skills so that we can also become global proactive citizens that can be engaged in a lot of the transformation that needs to take place. So that marriage of audience interaction with great content like we're having today, coupled with educational programs that deal with the systemic problems of our time, where people can get skills and abilities to actually address them. That's the future of this medium. And that's one of the approaches we want to take going forward. Connie, other things you see that can and need to happen?
People have been asking me why I just spent years writing about age and what it has to do with shadow work. And so for me, there are 10,000 people turning 65 every day just in our country. The global population is aging rapidly and the birth rate is down. So for me, the baby boom generation has a wealth of experience, a huge percentage of financial resources, and most of us are not engaged with the issues that we're talking about here, whether it's individual exploring consciousness, healing the past, and consciously moving toward life completion, or whether it's activism and engagement in the larger causes. So my work right now is with boomers. And I have several events coming up with Bill McKibben because the climate crisis is my passion. And I want to suggest that for this question, what can one person do, needs to be answered by join with others, join community, and amplify your efforts in community. And so for me, George, I'm completely with you. I think that we are far past individual inner work or recycling. We're in the catastrophe now. And we need to connect our inner work to social action, activism, whatever that means, whatever the call is for someone, because it's different for everyone. It's not climate for everyone. For some people, it's democracy, voting. For other people, it's gun violence. For other people, it's hunger. So get engaged with what is really speaking to you right now with urgency, and find your way to community to do that. It will end your feelings of isolation because you can find, a kinship group, and it will give you purpose and meaning in this difficult time.
Thank you, Connie. Sedina and I have obviously spent a number of decades dealing with the population that you're talking about, and we still do with Age Nation. I often remember, I'm sure you're familiar with Michael Mead's book, Fate and Destiny.
That's one of the best.
Yeah, it is. And one of the things Michael talks about is he defines or divides people who are older into two categories, olders and elders. Olders, those that have become somewhat rigid and calcified by virtue of not doing their inner work, and elders, those who are continuing to step out to inherit their destiny. And so I think we need a lot more elders than olders. That's one thing that we can certainly do. I also think that this question of what I call in extremis, it keeps me up day and night, because I keep believing that together there are many things that each of us can do, and some of them need to be prioritized. For an example, I agree with you, Connie, it's good to go where your heart calls you and where your interest lies. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of our interests are not going to be possible if we lose democracy. So perhaps at the top of everybody's list ought to be, what can I do today and every day to contribute to keeping democracy alive so that we'll continue to have opportunity to do some of the work we need to do. Peter, you have something?
I think a lot of us have had habits of being. My whole life I've considered myself a liberal. When I looked at what liberals are doing now, I'm not excited about that. The fact of voting another party, so I think we have to open up our idea of what's real. I think one of the reasons we had the problem with the Supreme Court is because a lot of people could not see that Hillary was at least a lesser evil than Trump. And so I think we have to realize that we can get a short step that's better than no step. And at the same time, have a big enough reality to realize that what's happening now is not sustainable. The three pillars of government I mentioned before are falling apart. So the universe, in my experience, probably in a year or two, looks for balance and sustainability. Something can arise. And so I think one of the ways that can happen is to create images and pictures that people can understand. People can trust that there's a process happening. People can trust that in spite of all the bad things that are happening in the world, that there are people like our group and groups like this all over the world that are actually doing something positive and creating a momentum. We don't see that on the news. We don't hear about that. So to talk to people, to put out pictures in our writing and what we're doing today, to create positive viewpoints that are happening now, to give people something to latch onto and hold on to while these things develop and are created. Because people do not have a very positive idea of what's happening. Their view becomes very small, and they forget that there's a big momentum that's positive, evolutionary, and changing right now. And to encourage people in that hope and that positive vision, I think is really important to let the little parts coalesce.
Thank you, Peter. I'm noticing in the chat that a number of people are asking how they get in touch with each of you. So would you each be sure that you put your URLs and email contacts in the chat? The week has been largely about healing strategies, let's take a couple of moments to talk about how you believe the strategies that you most value can reach larger and larger audiences. I mean, obviously, Deborah, you're publishing books that make that possible. How else?
Yeah, well, I'm shifting to, I just started to work with the people that did the educational community outreach program from the Fantastic Fungi film. Those of you that have signed up for that mailing list, they're curriculum developers, and I've hired them to task to help me figure out how to institutionalize biospheric language into the educational system. because it's just ridiculous that we have high school kids that don't know anything about nature. They don't know how the world works. It has to be part of the educational system. My partner, John Allen, calls it the seducation system at this point. We have run down this is kind of like a 10-year project. We do have to, make small steps, but I'm just trying to get the infographics. I think, Peter, you're absolutely right. We have to have popular images that can get these complex ideas across. So I'm looking for, these graphic design geniuses that can take scientific information and make it something that people can actually, read and understand while they're eating their popsicle. The fantastic fungi, the company that developed these outreach, they did Kiss the Ground, they did many of the other environmental films, they did all these educational outreach because they felt that film was where most of the popular people, most of the populace are paying attention. And that was the biggest way to get to influence how to take these important information and knowledge and ideas from things like Kiss the Ground and fantastic fungi and get it into modules that would reach broad public. So I think that we have to ally with organized groups. Absolutely, Connie, that is totally the way I'm allying with the people that develop the fantastic fungi rollout to try to get biospheric ideas out there.
Other thoughts?
George, actually, I would like to speak to something I said a little bit earlier. Besides being a therapist and a coach, I spent 22 years, just retired last year, doing partisan public policy. My role is to bring conservatives, liberals, libertarians, and progressives together on a wide variety of issues over those 22 years, launch campaigns, launch coalitions, very successful up until the last couple of years. We can have a conversation about that later. But there was a lot of very interesting, if you want to kind of narrow down to left-right conversations and activities that were occurring. And I think it'd be really helpful on those same lines to do two things. One is to engage as many people in conversations, not with the intent of persuading people that you're right and they're wrong, but getting to understand why they believe what they believe. Because most people who believe different than you, and maybe if you want to put it this way, have more of a limited view and don't have the same fear of the problems that we face, most likely are being driven by bad information, misinformation, or fear themselves. That if we don't take it seriously and help them address it, we're going to lose them as part of our democracy, which is not really helpful to us. The second piece of that too is, I wrote in the chat function, we need to work outside of our silos. We need to work a very interdisciplinary approach. And I remember going to an environmental conference years and years and years ago, and I noticed the food. I was like, okay, they're interested in the macrobiome, if you want to put it that way, saving the environment. But looking at the food, they're like, well, they really didn't know enough to understand the microbiome, like what they're doing to their own bodies with the food that they're choosing for this conference. There was this just kind of lack of integration, integrity, lack of like expansion of vision. And I think it'd be helpful if we could break out of our own silos and see how the same principles and values that guide us where we have our lane also can be expressed in many different areas and work together across those silos. So if your big thing is food, great. Working also in medicine, because there's a connection obviously to food and medicine. If your big thing is that, but you can connect to the folks in the alternative education space. There's a lot of really interesting experiments going on there. So just expand beyond your silo, understand what's going on. You can be a force multiplier in the market, which is a huge thing, change the market dynamics, which is a positive too. But you can also do that same thing in the democratic space to change policy at various levels, whether it's international, national, state, or very local. And the last little bit too, is I suggest we don't just focus on government as the solutions to the problems that we face, because having spent 22 years working in this space, government is the cause of a lot of the problems that we face. We need to work with them, but we also have to work much closer to home and decentralize power as much as possible and solve our problems as locally as possible, and not use the coercive power of the state necessarily to solve our problems. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Anne, and then Peter.
I love what you're saying, Michael. I think that following our interest in getting engaged at the level that we feel pulled to is so important. And one thing I noticed with my clients in clinic is, when people get out of balance, they have a hard time even trusting their appetites or knowing what appeals to them. When we're in a very healthy state, we'll have a very appropriate craving for healthy relationships and healthy foods. But when we get a little bit out, we start to feel confusion and even crave something that might be toxic to us, right? And so, of course, what we all have accessible to us is like, diet and lifestyle and health practices, exercise, and so forth. But this is also a place that I find that Chinese pole star astrology can be useful, and the plant medicines, psychedelics as well, because one of the things about astrology is it helps us connect to, okay, well, I see my friend over here and she's very passionate about this thing. Maybe I should get involved in that. Well, is that really where the bulk of my energy should go? When we look at when we use ancient technology such as Chinese pole star astrology, we can see, oh, this is where I have power in the world. And this is where I have suffering. And when I keep trying to put energy into where that part of my life isn't working, it keeps not working because I don't have power there. But over here in this aspect of my life, maybe it's career, maybe it's children, maybe it's, working with the land, maybe it's working in depth in our personal relationships or family of origin things. It's everyone's chart's a little bit different. And so when we have the chance to look at our unique imprint in the world, that can help us find that freedom and then do exactly what Michael just said, and just throw everything behind that. Of course, you don't need astrology to connect with what your thing is, but I encourage everyone to look for ways to connect deeply with what their chi expression is in the world.
Thank you, Anne. Peter?
I really want to dovetail on the beauty of what Anne just said. We get so concerned about these causes in the world, the problems in the world, that we forget ourselves. We forget to be home. We forget how we feel about things. Like I had a lady yesterday that came into the clinic and I said, "How are you?" She said, "I'm fine." But you could tell that there was tension in her heart. As soon as she felt her heart, her whole body changed, her mood changed. You could see that once she touched here inside herself, her world changed, her perceptions grounded. And it's easy to become angry or despondent about what's going on in the world. But if we just remember to encourage ourselves and each other, like we started this program today, we started with a meditation, being inside. It changes things. People begin to find their path, as Anne was saying, not somebody else that they should do. What's my ability? I'm 73. I'm making decisions now about what I want to to accomplish in the rest of my life. I have 4 planets in Gemini. I would do everything. So now I'm really making decisions about who I am, what's possible. And I also want to add, we have such a serious tone when we're looking to solve the problems in the world. And yet fun, not superficial fun, but the deep bliss and joy of being is what translates. It's what communicates with language and people and feeling. And if you can laugh with somebody that's polarized from you in opinions, you'll find a bridge to make it together. So there's a whole, if you look at the physiology of spiritual development, the experience of joy, of happiness, of being without attachment is the basic expression of life. It's the basic expression of how the universe communicates through us and into the world. And if we just remember to enjoy what we're doing, to share that joy, to be happy and to share that, not to dismiss the suffering and everything, but to heal the suffering with some sort of innate being of goodness. And that translates beyond language, beyond ideology and so forth. So I just want to encourage myself, everyone else, to kind of remember to have more fun with what we're doing, because that people hear that.
I want to pick up on that just a little bit, in that the whole concept of these programs is to talk about healing strategies and healing methodologies. Hello, Cosmo. Yes, he's when I think about fun, we were talking to Stan yesterday about some shortcuts in the evolution of the planet. And we were talking about the possibility of having a week's retreat for every government, for the UN, and all of the bodies of sobriety and seriousness in the world and introduce them to psychedelics as a way of changing their perception, because in some ways what we're talking about is that we can take a long route, or sometimes we can take a short route, and that short route, thankfully, with plant-based medicines and psychedelics and other elements, holotropic breath work and other kinds of deep meditation, in a moment we can have an experience that short circuits whatever the belief system is that we've been operating on. Isn't that some of your experience in the work that you've done with the different modalities that you've worked with?
Well, I would make a distinction, George, between a state experience like you're describing from psychedelics and a stage of experience like Ken Wilber talks about so eloquently. And so if we look developmentally at where humanity is at, much of our species is in a very primitive stage of development. And there are lots of incredible podcasts now that are attempting to explain what's happening in this developmental model, which for me is really crucial. It's a missing piece in so many things that I tune into. So I'm not a big fan anymore of sort of altered states that don't lead to new levels of awareness that actually stabilized levels of consciousness or stages of awareness. And so for me, I would urge people working in the plant medicine arena to continue to work with folks to really embody that state and integrate it into a new stage of consciousness. And that's, of course, what the contemplative traditions have always sought to do.
And I agree completely with you on the contemplative traditions. And I am of two minds when I look at in extremis, and I think what could happen if people had at least the opportunity to see beyond the veil, even for a short period of time.
I hear you.
Okay.
Get a glimpse.
Get a glimpse, and then do the work that needs to happen to turn it from a state to a stage. Other thoughts on, yes, Peter? I'm sorry, Michael.
No, please, Peter, go ahead.
You know, my son was terrified of dying, and then he did LSD, and he's not terrified of dying anymore. And this fundamental fear of the future and death is so primal in all of us. But we don't have to necessarily do psychedelics. The plant medicines, in my work, and I think and many of your work, it's not just taking you beyond, but it's taking you in and opening up things. With plant medicines, we can create a release of the blockages and the hesitancies of the system to flow and move, and we can open up the heart, we can open up the mind, we can do things like that. So you can do that with microdoses of psilocybin and other things. You can do that with various plant medicines from the Chinese, Vedic, and Tibetan traditions. And if somebody really needs to break through, then with a guide and perhaps a ceremony, something to keep it from being entertainment and to focus in on evolution and development, singularly as an experience to break through something or to get to the next level. But I think that there's a whole range from very mild to very intense plant medicines. And I don't think people realize that. And so I think it's important to share that, to let people I see people for anxiety and depression frequently and other things, and people are used to taking medicines and covering it over. They don't realize you can heal from these things. These things are just affects in the physiology that can change and grow and open. And we've been so brainwashed by the pharmaceutical industry. A good friend of mine was the head of psychiatric training at California Pacific Medical Center. His is one of only 2 psychiatric programs in the country that taught psychotherapy. Almost all the psychotherapy, all the psychiatric training in the country is handled by the drug companies. They actually go in and tell people this is how you do it. So people don't realize they can heal and change. These are just issues like colds and flus and a back pain that you can heal and change. And people don't remember that. People don't realize that because we've been brainwashed by these corporate entities that just have selfish greed and profit in mind. And so education, talking, loving, being, these are important things to reframe society. I mean, like this whole COVID thing, people got terrified of viruses. Well, viruses are actually very fragile things. And once they're exposed to a surface, you can treat them easily. That was covered over by the media, and people went all these different directions. So there's been so much information, misinformation. So if we can find a way to communicate that, to share what's possible without blame, with understanding, that it, as I was saying before, it creates a different picture of what's possible and what is.
Thank you, Peter. Michael?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that I think the psychedelic renaissance is a good thing, but I had four basic concerns. One of them is the limitations of conventional psychology. Transpersonal, somatic, and eco-centered approaches are not included in the conventional schools of psychology. And I noticed, like, for instance, some of these ketamine clinics that are emerging, and I have concerns about the whole process, like the preparation before, the setting during, the integration afterwards. That's a whole conversation that we can have. But if these clinicians who are working with these people in these non-ordinary states of consciousness do not understand non-ordinary states of consciousness, transpersonal psychology, how the body actually, energy moves through the body, thinking of what Peter says, how to be with someone in these states of consciousness, how to assist them through some of these cathartic moments, help them integrate it, then I think we're asking for a lot of trouble. Because I think you're going to have a lot of people who are blown open, that they have an ascending higher state ecstatic experience, but they don't know how to integrate it into their body mind system, into their system, and then into their life. Like, how do you integrate that into your marriage, into your life with your kids, your neighbors, your friends? So I think it'd be helpful at some point for all of us to have a conversation about, wow, we need to rethink psychology. And I know Dr. Groff, who I studied under, he has this whole theory around that and this whole holotropic approach, which is a nice one way of thinking about it. But I think a broader conversation collectively would be helpful, because if these clinicians do not know how to work with people in non-ordinary states, like I said, we're just asking for a lot of trouble. And then thinking about something that Ann said earlier, and then going to what Deborah was saying in terms of the biospheres, most of the medicines and the way they're used presently, and I don't mean in Amazonian rainforest ways, but here in the States, like for a weekend workshop, underground, not in the clinical sense, is very ascending. You're shape-shifting machine elves, and you're talking to the gods and all these kind of higher, really interesting things. But there's not practices to ground it back into the body. Not practice to ground the body back into the earth. Because then you're just gonna have people floating around. And the biospheric challenges we face are going to be even more challenging because people aren't going to care. They're like, oh, I'm not my body. I'm not the earth. I'm this other thing. I'll stop there.
Well, and maybe in one of our future weeks on this conversation, we can get more deeply into those grounding practices and some of the strategies that are not being used enough that can be used more of. Anne?
I'm in this role with some percentage of my patients in my clinic where, whether it's helping people stabilize and integrate, they schedule to see me the day after their ketamine treatment, or people who have come to me because they're working with plant medicines or mushrooms, or for instance, on their own, and maybe have had an adverse experience and they're looking for ways to patch together their energy body using acupuncture and Chinese medicine. And one of the things that to this point, so I'm glad that we're discussing the risks, but one of the things that Peter was saying also makes me think about how I remember when I was in school studying acupuncture. And many of the students were saying, I really want to learn the spiritual points. I want to learn the spiritual points. How do I, what are the psychology points that are going to help people really go deep? And what became apparent is, if you're really sitting with someone and a person is really being met with appropriate differential diagnosis. So really good tongue and pulse, a really carefully written formula that doesn't have to include any psychedelics. A really good formula, a really good point protocol is going to bring someone to that place of healing and integration that they're so craving. It doesn't have to be like a special point or a special plant or special substance to be able to find that. Really, the thing that breaks open worlds and provides insight is working on what really needs to be worked on. And so however we find what that is, however we can drop into that, that's where the growth edge can be found.
So, Deborah, you've been quiet for a while.
Lots of people try to get me to do that. You've been very successful. Psychedelic integration is a very big missing. We're a bit behind in terms of the availability of services and understanding within the community to help people integrate their psychedelic experiences, whether they had it for medicinal purposes or spiritual growth. There are more books now available about that. We do have a lot of them. MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, maps.org, is an extraordinary organization that's been pioneering for the last 15 years the effort to decriminalize many of these substances and to forge research in the medical space. So I recommend for people that they're looking for local clinics or look at they're in training a number of practitioners. There are other organizations, USONA, other groups around, and there's just to try to get references to find out further resources for people. But people don't even understand about the idea that you have to do integration after you take psychedelics. So the community is trying to catch up with the use and the availability, and because now the decriminalization and making it more available in certain states where mushroom psilocybin. So education does need to catch up with the front lines. Is basically that. So, but there are a lot of resources available for people, but it's the rebranding of psychedelics, changing people's minds, situation that we're in where I use my mother as a litmus test. I'll send her something. Well, here's a New York Times article about MDMA and how revolutionary it is for the treatment of PTSD. How does that impress you? And my parents say, oh, it's so wonderful that you're selling so many books, but they're all about drugs. And I said, yeah, but you go to the drugstore every single day. You have 25 prescriptions. They're all drugs. And some of them are really nasty. I mean, some of these are very natural. So I have been trying to be able to listen to what their fears are. And it's really just because they really have deep seated beliefs and understandings going, about how psychedelics in the war on drugs impacted our entire social consciousness. So it's a big rock to push in a different direction. So there's also the Netflix series based on Michael Pollan's book just released yesterday called How to Change Your Minds. And I think programs like that, which will reach a broad public, will help to allow these clinics and more community-based resources for people that just really need to have that support. And of course, the people like Peter and Ann and caregivers that are helping people, they're pioneers in this field, and they've been working under extraordinary circumstances because it's been illegal in many states to engage with some of these substances. Thank goodness we are seeing an opening in that area.
What you said, Deborah, when you were talking about integration after psychedelics, as you said it, I think the truth is, and our society suffers from it, you need integration after everything. And we don't, really. And whether it's a traumatic event or a euphoric event or a breakthrough event or an ordinary event, everything that touches our lives requires some level of pause, reflection, integration. And the more we do that, I think, the more we become whole as individuals and therefore as a society. But it's a wonderful thing that you said that just triggered that. Jim, I'm going to invite you.
I just want to add that that's absolutely right. You need to eat your experiences. The Sufi story is to eat all the halva that you made in that day, to digest your experiences. And my good friend and one of our authors, Ralph Metzner, always had these great epiphanies that he would say, consciousness, changing your state of consciousness. Every morning when we wake up, we change our state of consciousness.
Yeah. Thanks, Deborah. Jim, you there? Come on back in.
Thank you, everyone. Great conversation. I would, there's a lot that I would love to say, but I would start with the last point, Deborah, about Michael Pollan's Netflix that just came out over the last couple of days. I watched the first session, first program on LSD. And he made a very interesting point about when it was shut down, that during the 1950s and 60s, there was a plethora of studies and much excitement in the medical community and the psychotherapy community, among psychiatrists using LSD for all kinds of therapeutic purposes. And then as it began to get into the mainstream, and ran up against the brick rock of the Richard Nixon administration, the government, understanding that part of the effect of LSD in the culture was turning young men against the war. Vietnam was the only war in history that at least I know about where the young men en masse refused to fight. And the Nixon administration identified psychedelics as a threat to national security and basically shut them down. And so I think that's worth bringing in, and I would love to have your various comments, because we're teetering on the brink of authoritarianism here in the United States. Yeah. We have rising authoritarianism worldwide. It's clear that whatever the particular effects of these psychedelics and plant medicines are on the human psyche and body, they can heal the body, but they also free the psyche. And that's generally perceived as very dangerous by governments. And so in our excitement about it, and which I share, and because part of my awakening around the Vietnam War, I turned 18 in 1969, was with concurrent use of psychedelics, and there wasn't even a question in my mind that I was not going to go to Vietnam. I mean, it wasn't even a rational, logical thought. But it was the result of the illumination that came out of the psychedelics and other things that I was taking at that time. And it wasn't premeditated. It was just, as you know from your own experience, you have the experience and miss the meaning. And as Eliot says, meaning only comes over time. So as a young man, it just all happened simultaneously. We didn't make any of the connections in those days. We were just acting spontaneously in the integrity of our spirits. So given the world situation, I just would love to hear your comments on this relationship between the freedom of psychedelics and the rising authoritarianism, and how one navigates through this thicket.
I think one of the issues that we find with psychedelics is if a person is not grounded, to revisit something, it can create a disassociation. It can create a lack of focus. And in a way, it can disturb the positive momentum that's happening. Not that they're a bad thing, but this idea that it needs a container and it needs a path and a process. And I think that's one of the things we really need to work toward in the psychedelic realm because they're powerful, they're great, they're fantastic, they're the messengers of the gods to speak. But I don't think there's enough organization around that, and people think that it's just something to party. And I would have loved to see Richard Nixon on acid. I think that would have changed the world.
Sure, he would have changed the course of his presidency.
I think we'd have rainbows coming out of the army if Nixon had acid. But that's a whole other fantasy.
So, hey, Jim, I have a couple of comments and questions, and actually a question for Connie. So I lean pretty libertarian, minimize the state. I think people should be free to do whatever they want to as adults with their bodies, their minds, etc. But I've been rethinking the war on drugs from that time period you're discussing, Nixon administration, from maybe from a more transpersonal perspective. And I'm curious, this is a question for you, Connie, because I know you know Wilbur's work and stages and states and all that kind of good stuff. Is it possible that too much energy was being released in the system? And I don't mean individual systems, although it's true, but in the body politic and the culture, that is just too much for the system, largely speaking, to handle it. So we're actually quenching or crushing the psychedelic movement, although it's horrible, and we can argue that it shouldn't have been done, might have actually served a particular purpose, more transpersonally orienting. And I'm curious, am I off? Am I crazy? Do you see anything there, Connie? Because you're the shadow person, so I'm curious.
Yeah, boy, this is beyond my pay grade. I don't think we can quantify consciousness or the unconscious. I don't think we really can have the capacity to see the complexity of what's happening, Michael. When Jim was describing these moments when the government made all the medicines Schedule 1, one of the things that happened was Ram Dass, who was at Harvard and an early LSD researcher, ended up going to India and finding his guru and coming back and teaching millions of people how to meditate. So we don't know when things happen, what the outcomes are going to be in the complexity of the system that we live in, and I think that so I don't know how to respond to that, except that on an individual level, if there's too much expansion, like Peter said, there can be dissociation, but there can also be, and this is a developmental question, there can also be ego inflation. So if the ego identifies with expanded consciousness, rather than moving beyond the ego, rather than allowing it to be a transpersonal or beyond ego experience, the ego grasps it and unconsciously identifies with it. I am God. And then what happens, right? I worked for 6 months in an inpatient psychiatric facility where most of the people believed they were God. So, right? So Stan would call that spiritual emergency in some cases. So it's so complex to look at it sort of systemically or cosmologically. I don't think we can see that level.
Thanks, Connie.
Connie, you are aware of that wonderful story that Ram Dass talks about when he visited his brother who was institutionalized. And his brother said to him, I don't understand, you run around the world talking about God and all the rest of it, and I talk about it here and I get further confinement. And he said, the difference, he said, is that I don't think I'm the only God.
Right.
So,
he was so pithy, He was so, and the subtitle of my book, Shifting from Role to Soul, is from Ram Dass. I didn't make that up. So I give him credit for so much. He changed our lives, many of us. And that happened because drug research was shut down. So I'm just saying, we don't know.
Yeah. So I think we're getting close to wrapping up today, aren't we, Jim? It's just, it's been a wonderful conversation. I can't thank each of you enough for taking the time to spend with us. I'm sorry we had some challenges a little in some of the linkages and whatnot, but all of you showed up and you've all contributed greatly. And I hope that as we think about future weeks in this series, that you'll help us think of other voices that should be a part of it and other ways that you might want to contribute.
Have you had Rick Doblin?
Say that again.
Have you had
Yes.
Rick Doblin?
We
You
had
have.
Rick
Okay.
last year with Stan Groff's 90th birthday celebration.
Yeah.
He was superb. Rick is on the front lines, and
Yes.
and I want to just acknowledge the courage that all of you are demonstrating in your lives. And I think Connie's making a very important point. You know, we don't know how it's all going to turn out, and we don't know the turns and twists in the road. We can look back over the last 50 years and see that after the initial exuberance, everything was shut down. And now over the last couple of years, we're having sort of a second renaissance where people are popping their heads up for the second time, and so far so good, but everything is still tentative. And how the increasing turbulence of the ecosystem, how the increasing authoritarianism around the world, particularly here in the United States, is going to play out is unknown, and how that will affect ongoing psychedelic research, I think, is yet to be determined. So I just want to acknowledge and thank all of you for being in this space, because I think what all of us are carrying is that there's something profoundly important for human beings in the plants.
Yeah.
And the effect can be explosive if you're ungrounded. It can be massively healing if you need healing of the body, heart, or mind. And yet, because of the very nature of it, it is not something that is easily controlled by the rational mind. And I think civilization is still terrified at that prospect. So everything that you're doing is so important in terms of leading us to where we need to go. So I want to thank you all for that. And George, thank you for convening this. And George is right. We're going to continue to deepen this dialogue because it's what's up for humanity if it's indeed going to rise to the levels we all need in order to secure the future that we all want.
And please remember to vote for democracy while we're covering all of these other challenges and topics, because whether we believe it or not, if you consider a world where democracy, even in its imperfect form, isn't present, you can understand that our lives and the lives of humanity will change dramatically. So please vote and tell everybody you know to vote, and blessings and thank you all, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
And then
all.
on
It's very
Monday,
nice
we're
to
going to
meet
go to
you.
Namibia with Lori Markle, and we're going to just luxuriate in the boundless energy of the cheetahs,
Ah,
a species that's threatened, but a species, if you've seen a cheetah run, can inspire the soul. So that's Monday on Humanity Rising, and then our week will unfold from there. One of the beautiful things about Humanity Rising is we try to leave no nook or corner unturned in terms of what we bring to our Humanity Rising community. So thank you all. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box that Stan just put in. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you Monday. Bye for now.
Bye.